This is my second video in the series of the early Beatles. I would like to shortly come up with some comments to the first video. Well, the question that might have puzzled some is that they might have heard that John Lennon was very much against jazz, and I was saying a lot about jazz in the first video. And it's true, he was, and I was, but what I was talking about was that Skiffle became a thing of its own. It came from the revival movement, but sort of settled its own and were mixed up with, sorry, that I guess means something else, blended with all kinds of other stuff. The Quarrymen at a very early point included rock and roll tunes in their repertoire. And they were actually playing a gig at the Cavern long before, the famous Cavern era. It was while it was a jazz club at that time, and they were almost pushed down the stage for playing rock and roll tunes. Because I didn't mention that in the first video, the Cavern started as a jazz club. It was actually a concept directly copied, or you could say stolen, from a French jazz club. One of the guys that started it all up were in French and saw a place called Les Caveaux. I don't know if that pronounced right. My English may be lousy, but I don't speak one word French. So, but the same word in French as the Cavern. And it was like that, going down to a cellar and a quite little place and playing music there. And he said, oh, that's cool. So he found a place in Liverpool. It was actually an old storeroom for vegetables. And the story goes that even after it has been a music club for several years, there was still an odor of old vegetables. So, yeah, in the Quarrymen days, they actually played a gig at the Cavern. It was still a jazz club, and it was not a thing anyone liked at that point that they were playing rock and roll tunes. As I said, Skiffle became a thing of its own, and folk music, well, a bit of rock and roll, a bit of country and western, all sorts of things. And I guess what made it so English is that they incorporated some of those things, about English singing in the pop thing, all that, and someone sits at the piano and they are standing there with their beers and singing something, something that could give you an idea of that thing. Mother's Lament with the cream from Disraeli Gears. There you sort of got it. And Yardbirds made that very similar, I Remember the Night. So that kind of English pop singing, and incorporated all that atmosphere of jolly, cozy, visiting the neighbor and sitting down in the kitchen, and now let's have a nice cup of tea. All that stuff was sort of incorporated to it. So even though it was so deeply rooted in American music, it got this very British twist. But what I was trying most of all to say in my first video is this was the point where all those youngsters found out that they could actually play music themselves. They discovered that it was not that there were some other kinds of people, some special kinds that were these musicians, and oh, I can never do that. Suddenly they discovered it's possible for me to play music. And that was what I was trying to say. And this little sum up kind of leads to what I would try to talk about in this video, because I was kind of saying, oh, some people may have thought about what about that and what about that. And it's very possible that someone watching have some specific questions, or there are some sub-subject they are interested in, and not the whole thing. And maybe some people just want to study it on their own, and they're saying, why do I have to sit and look at a whole bunch of videos with a guy that can't speak proper English, and such thing, and saying, well, it must be possible for me to make my own studies at this thing. So in this video I will talk a bit about different books, and albums, vinyls and CDs and such stuff, and other sources if you want to study the subject of your own. And also for those of you who may have some very specific questions and might just sit and wait while I'm talking about all sorts of other things and saying, well, will he ever come to say something about that thing that I would really like to know something about? You don't have to watch a lot of videos with me. You can find out yourself. And that's what I will say something about in this video. If you want to know a bit more about Skiffle, there are 3 books I can recommend. There's this one, The Skiffle Craze by Mike Dew, with Foreword by Chris Barber. And what maybe is a little bit more interested for Beatles fans is this one, just called Skiffle, The Definitive Inside Story, written by Chas McDavid, who was one of the big Skiffle stars. And there are forewords to it, just like Chris Barber read a foreword to my Dew's book. Here are not less than 3 forewords. There's one by Mark Knopfler, the guitarist from the Dire Straits. There's one by Joe Brown, a pop star from the early 60s, very rooted in Skiffle. And here it goes. There's one from George Harrison. Yes, George Harrison. And it's, I wouldn't spoil the surprise, but here it is, Mark Knopfler and George Harrison. They may not think that Joe Brown is famous enough to be mentioned here. They are very good. They are informative and tell the story. Not quite in the same way. They have a bit of a different approach to the subject, but that's a good thing. They kind of supplement, what do you call it? It's a good thing to have them both. The only thing I have to say is that they are written much later, so they are retrospective. that's not a bad thing, but it's just something you got to know. So if you like to know, well, but how was it when it was happening? The zeitgeist, and if you want something that is actually from the same period that someone was sitting there and writing while it all was happening. There is one. As far as I know, it's the only one there is. Skiffle, the story, a folk song with a jazz beat by Brian Bird and with foreword by Lonnie Donegan. Brian Bird was a village vicar and a big jazz fan, and was very concerned about the youth in his village. And being a jazz fan, when all that skiffle craze began, he thought that was a good idea, and he was backing it up and was actually took part in making a youth club for jazz and skiffle, and they had their own skiffle band and all sorts of things. And by the way he writes, he seems like a that must not happen. He seems to be a quite funny fellow. He doesn't look like that if you look there, but the impression you got from that picture is not similar to the one you get when you're reading the book. I really love this book. I can tell you. I read it over and over and over again. I lost count a long time ago. So, yeah, there are 3 really good books, and in those you can find almost anything you want to know about skiffle. But as great as it can be to know the story and understanding more about things, well, the main thing, of course, is still the music. What is there out there where you can actually hear the music? Oh, there is something. And I will not all of my collection that then it would fill up this whole video, but I will show you some few things you can go for and collect. Well, depending on whether you are mostly collecting vinyl or mostly collecting CDs, there is a bit that makes a bit of a difference. I will mention some CDs here and then go on to some vinyl. As I told in the first video, the kind of forerunner for skiffle was the old jug bands, and besides that, also actually a lot of jazz recordings and recordings by blues musicians in the 20s and 30s using washboard. It was not that uncommon. You can hear it on many records. I will not go into that. As I also said in the first video, you can always dig deeper. And at some point you're ending up with Adam and Eve or the Big Bang or something. So, but if someone really, really would like to know some titles of some good compilations with jug band music and such stuff, please leave a comment in the down below, and I will give you some titles. But here I would stick to the British thing that happened in the 50s. And for many Beatles fans, the important thing to get hand of would, of course, be Bad Penny Blues. with Johnny Parker's piano playing that inspired Paul McCartney for Lady Madonna. Well, there is actually this compilation called Bad Penny Blues with recordings by Humphrey Lyttelton from 55 to 56. They recorded Bad Penny Blues in 56. I said in the first video, oh, give or take 10 years. Well, as you can count out, it was actually 12 years from 56 to 68. That one is not that important. Oh, here's something. A compilation, Crane River Band. I told you about Ken Collier in the first video, the jazz purist that couldn't get it pure enough, and he was in this Crane River Band, and I told you about they were also making things more leaning at blues and folk and such things, and there are some examples here. Actually, the opening song called Muddy Old River, you won't hear any blowing instruments there. It's just guitars, and well, it might be made in the early 50s, but it's sounding like more like an old blues recording from the 30s or something. So this is kind of where it all began. And yeah, you got Ken Collier there, and the clarinet player here, that is Monty Sunshine, who later became a part of the Chris Barber Band. And then we move a little bit on, because here we got a collection from a series called the Vintage, and there I can tell you there are many good things in that series, but this one is particularly interesting. You can see it's Ken Collier, but if you turn it around, you can see here featuring Chris Barber, Monty Sunshine, and Lonnie Donegan. And you can actually see here that there are some jazz there are some jazz tunes here, but then you can actually see here there's called the Skiffle set. 4 songs here with a very young Lonnie Donegan singing long before he became the king of skiffle. Well, I got a lot of other things with Ken Collier here. I won't mention those. I will try to really stick to the most important releases and not take just anything with a wake.